Good morning. Welcome to Saturday morning Bible study. I have Facebook Live going, and I've got the Zoom room open. So if you want to join on Zoom, you can. And I'm excited that you've joined me this morning, wherever you're joining from. So give everyone a couple seconds. I started the video a minute early this morning, so just whenever you hop on, be sure to say hi, good morning, and we will get started with Bible study in just a moment. Hi Lori, hi Marcia. I'm glad you guys could join us this morning. Hey Gidget, you're let's see, I think hey, Marianne. Good morning. Good morning, Katina. Giving everyone a couple seconds to get on. Let's see here. Okay. Good morning. I'm so excited to study Esther with you all this morning. I think it's going to be super fun. I've been digging. Good morning, Jennifer. I am so excited to be with you guys this morning and studying Esther. It's going to be fun. All right, we've got a few people on Facebook Live with us and a couple on Zoom. If you're joining on Facebook Live and you want to get on the Zoom, join us in the Zoom room. I've posted the link. It should be right under in the last post before the live video this morning, so you can go join there. Hey Kathy. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We always begin with prayer. So let's start this morning with prayer over our Bible study, and we'll get started. Lord, I just love you, Jesus, and I'm thankful to have this opportunity to study your word this morning. And I just pray that you would give us the heart to understand your word and to learn more about you. I pray for every lady who joins this morning, God, that you would touch her mind and her heart, God. That we would grow closer to you and that we would know more of you through this Bible study. Lord, we just give it to you and pray that you would direct us, direct our conversation and our study this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. So, I'm excited to study Esther. I don't know why we haven't gotten to her yet, but I trust the Lord's timing, and that's kind of what the book is about too, trusting God's timing. So I think now is the right time, and I'm so excited because Esther is one of my favorite books of the Bible, and she's one of my favorite ladies in the Bible, and I'm just excited to get to study her. So I know I was kind of late in posting the questions yesterday, but the first question was, what do we know about the time period in which this story takes place, and why is it important? And as we do Bible study, I always talk about the 5 P's of Bible study, and the first one is prayer, and then the second being perspective. And we always talk about how whenever we read a book that it's best to get to know kind of what was going on in the world, what was going on in the Bible during that time. Hey, Kiara, good morning. And so the book of Esther is very different from the other ladies that we've studied and the other books that we've studied, in that the time period in which it takes place is probably a time period that we're not as familiar with. I'll speak for myself. It's a time period I'm not as familiar with in my Bible study. So when we studied Ruth, that was during the time of the judges, and I've you can read the book of Judges, and there's so many great Bible stories that come from that, like Samson and Gideon, and so some of those that we're more familiar with. And then we studied the ladies who were in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, and so that might be more familiar territory for you. But as we read Esther, it takes place during the time period of the books of like Ezra and Nehemiah. And for me, that's unfamiliar study. I'm not used to, I haven't, if I'm honest, I don't think I've read the whole book of Ezra or the whole book of Nehemiah. So I've read Esther several times, but I really had to dig in to find out more about the time period that this was written. I just read Kiara's comment. I'm sorry your internet's not working. Hopefully it'll pick back up and maybe you can come watch again with us later. So, good morning, Sandra. So I had to do some digging. So I want to know if you guys know anything about the time period or just what was going on in the world around the time that Esther takes place. I want to know what you know, but I'll tell you that I did some studying and I wanted to share this book with you guys. This is the Rose Book of Bible Charts, Maps, and Timelines, and I just wanted to share it because if you're a book person, of course, it's funny, I'm the technology coach at our school, but when it comes time to study, I always want a book. It's just easier for me to be able to put my hands on it. And so if you're the kind of person who likes a book to help you study, this came from Walmart, and there's like a whole series, and they're fairly inexpensive compared to like some other study Bibles and stuff. I think it was just like $10 or $12. And so I went to this book to look at the timeline, and but I also called my granddad because he has some books too, and I will say that they all said pretty much the same thing. Let's see. Marianne says, I had to dig also. The story takes place sometime between 483 BC to 473 BC when many Jews had returned to Judah trying to reestablish temple worship, but Esther and Mordecai stayed in Susa. Yeah, so a little just Jewish history if you need it, that we know that after the Judges, that the people of Israel wanted a king so bad. I should do a fast retell like I do for our kids videos. They wanted a king so bad, and so they had King Saul, and then they had David, and they had Solomon. And then kind of after that, the kingdom splits into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and they just have this string of mostly bad kings. A few good ones in there, but I mean, it was years and years and years of corrupt kings. And the kingdom of Israel and divided. The kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah just completely fell apart and fell under kind of foreign rule. The Assyrians took over Israel, and then the Babylonians took over Judah. And for years they were in exile. For 70 years they were in exile. They didn't have their own home. Jerusalem, the temple was destroyed, and it was just a really tough time for Israel. But after the Bible talks about these 70 years of exile, and if you study history, it's a very important time. It's those 70 years of exile. But they kind of came to an end when the Persians took over. And so the Persians came into world domination, I guess you would call it. And Cyrus, the king of Persia, when he began his rule, he said that the Jews could return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. And so Cyrus played a huge part in, as a world leader, kind of reestablishing Israel. But they still had to fight, because even though Cyrus the king gave them permission, the world was still kind of against them. But Zerubbabel, he finally rebuilt the temple. Morning, Sherry. Hey, Susie. And let's see, they rebuilt the temple, and about 40 years later is when Esther comes onto the scene. And there's a different king now. Cyrus isn't the king of Persia, but Ahasuerus, as the book of Esther calls him, or world history, Persian history, he goes by the name of Xerxes or Artaxerxes. You might have heard of him. And so that's the way I understood it as I was studying the timelines. And if you've got something different, please share it with me. But I'm kind of the person, I want to know the whole story. And so it helped me to kind of go back to the beginning and to go all the way through that. And it helps me to understand that during this time, like Mary Ann said, several Jews had started to return to Jerusalem, to Judah, but a lot of Jews did not. A lot of them were still living in the world, so to speak, still living amongst people who were not Jews. They were living amongst the Persians. They had, and to think about 70 years of exile, they had built a life. They had built a life there in Persia under the Persian reign. And so that's kind of where we are when Esther comes along. That I lost my train of thought. That's where we are when Esther comes along, that they've been living in exile, but they've got their temple rebuilt. And some people have gone back, but some people are still just living their lives that they had built over the past 70 years. And so I think it's important. The question was, what do we know about the time period and why is it important? I think it's important because it speaks a lot to how everything just the Jews had been through up to this point and why they were where they were. If you want to put a biblical time period on it, Esther, the story of Esther would kind of take place between the chapters 6 and 7 of Ezra. Ezra chapters 1 through 6 talk about the rebuilding of the temple. And then there's like this gap between 6 and 7. And that's where the story of Esther would have taken place. And then Ezra 7 to the end talks about Ezra and how he started teaching and talking about the laws and stuff again. So let's kind of dig into what we're just doing, chapters 1 and 2. And chapter 1 is really all about the king, Ahasuerus. His name's kind of hard to say, but chapter 1 is all about Ahasuerus. And so the question that I posed in our group yesterday was, what do we know about King Ahasuerus and how does he change from chapter 1 to chapter 2? And so if you just had some words that you could use to describe Ahasuerus, hey Mary, to kind of just summarize what happens in chapter 1, King Ahasuerus, he throws this giant feast. It says that it was 180 days just for him to show off his riches and his greatness. And then to close it out, they did this 7-day feast. At the end of 180 days, a 7-day feast seems kind of mild. And so they do this feast, and then the king wants Vashti to come out just to show off her beauty, come out wearing the royal crown, and she refuses. And the king, he's embarrassed, he's angry. He's talking to his wise men, these men who are just hanging out there with him, saying like, what are we going to do? And they come up with this plan, and they say, if Vashti thinks that she can do this, then all the other women in the kingdom are going to think when their husbands ask them to do something that they don't have to do it. And so we've got to make an example out of her. And so they kind of sit her down, tell her that she can't be queen anymore. So I don't know if when I was a kid we were VeggieTales watchers, and I don't know if you've ever seen the Esther VeggieTales movie. It's one of my favorites. And they in that movie they say the king fires the queen because she won't fix him a sandwich. And I always thought that was funny, but so I just kind of want to hear what you know about, or how you would describe King Ahasuerus, what you learn from him. Hey, Becky. It's okay. You're late. I'm glad you could join us. Marianne says that the king was arrogant, vain, and self-centered, and used all his wealth and power solely for his delight and pleasure. One of the things that I wrote down was that he acted out of anger, he acted out of self-interest. And that's kind of what Marianne said here too. It was about him. It was all about him and what was pleasing to him. And he wanted obviously the 180-day feast was just to show off his riches and his greatness. He wanted everyone to celebrate him. He was very self-centered, very. And let's see, what else? Yeah, even that the women, how he treated the women as competing as if in a beauty pageant for his pleasure, and had to come when he called them, was absurd. Yeah. And we really don't. We read about a lot of kings, and we read about a lot of women, and we really don't read about any other kings treating the women this way, except for Ahasuerus. And I'm sure that it happened, and maybe it just wasn't written about. But we read about kings like David and Solomon. He had a lot of wives, but I don't know that he treated them in this way. So it is, and it's so descriptive, and we don't know who wrote Esther, but obviously it was someone who maybe worked. Well, there's speculation that maybe it was Mordecai. He might have written it, especially if he worked in the palace. He would have known all these things that were happening. But whoever wrote this was able to give us a lot of insight to King Ahasuerus. And he was a Persian king, and so that's something that's interesting about this too. He was a Persian king, and so there's actually, outside of the Bible, there is history, there's world history about him as well. And so I didn't do a lot of research into that, but I was reading an article online about this. Well, I think it was online. It could have been in one of my books too, that the first King Artaxerxes, which was his Greek name, that he was known for being so angry. And there's this story that I read about him, but I also feel like I've read this about someone else maybe, so I don't know, it could be one of those things where they're not sure who, but anyways, I'll just say it. I read this story, and it said that Artaxerxes was known for his anger, that he was known for being so angry that there's actually a legend about him that once when he was at sea, that he was so angry that with the waves being, that he was so angry about the waves, the weather being so bad, that he ordered his men to give the waves 40 lashes. And so I don't know if you guys have heard that story before or not. But that was something I read this week. And I think that just speaks to King Ahasuerus and just his immaturity. I kind of wonder how old he was. I know that a lot of kings, that some of them would become king very young. And so maybe he was just a really young guy and just obviously, wanted to party all the time and wanted the women to come and just parade for him. And so I don't know, we just don't get a very good picture. But what I did write in my notes is that Ahasuerus and all of these men who serve him, they're a picture of the secular world. In the Bible, in every story, we have God's people and we have the world, people who don't serve God. And and even today, the world, people who, when I say the world, I just mean like the secular world, people who don't serve God, they act out of self-interest. It's an example of how the world operates, that it's always out of self-interest and pride and that's what the world, and that's what sin does. Sin wants you to just do what's pleasing to the flesh. And so Ahasuerus here and his men, they're an example of sin in the world, that sin will always tell you to do what's pleasing, what feels good. And so I don't like Ahasuerus here, but he's playing his part. And, that's something that I've heard said. The world is always going to do what the world's going to do. And that's why the church, that's why God's people, we have to do our job, because sin never fails to do its job. And so I see that here in Ahasuerus. He's just doing his part as a king in the world that doesn't serve God. But we do see that he changes in chapter 2. And so I'm going to read the second part of Marianne's comment. This changes in chapter 2 when he chooses Esther as queen. She had beauty, but also she was admired for her wisdom, humility, virtue, and character, her inner beauty. Yeah, and so we see a change even in the very first verse of chapter 2, that King Ahasuerus, it says, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And so to me, for him to have to remember that makes me think, obviously in the first chapter, it says that the drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. They had been drunk for like 180 days, and then especially for the last 7. I mean, they had just partied so hard. They were drinking so much. There was no compulsion. They were doing whatever was pleasing to them. And so in chapter 2, we see that King Ahasuerus, he just kind of comes out of this stupor, like, oh my gosh, I've been partying, like almost just blacked out partying for all this time. And he kind of comes to himself in chapter 2, and it says he remembers. It's like he wakes up and thinks, oh, I just realized what I've done. I fired the queen, and so now I've got to do something about it. And so he gathers all the young virgins to come, and it is, they come in to him and all of this, but and maybe it's the romantic inside of me. You read at the end kind of chapter 2, it's verse 17, that the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And so he had his pick. All of these women who came to him, he had his pick, and it just makes me think that, the verse says that he loved Esther, and maybe he loved her for her beauty, but I think it was more than that, because of what we know about Esther's character, and that she won favor in his sight. And as we read on, as we get into some of the later chapters, we find that Esther does some things that are against the rules. She goes to King Ahasuerus, and when she's not supposed to, she kind of breaks the rules, and he shows, and we'll get to that, but he shows her grace time and time again, and he doesn't punish her. And so it just makes me feel like he did really have real feelings for Esther. I think he really did love her and had real feelings towards her. And then I like there at the end too, in the end of verse 18, it says he also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So that's different from throwing a party that's all about yourself, and having that attitude of me, 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 and now he's being generous, and he's there giving a break in taxes, like a gift only a king can give. So I do think that we see a change in King Ahasuerus from chapter 1 to chapter 2, and I think it's more evident as the book goes on as well. So, anything else anybody wants to say about King Ahasuerus? Let's see. Shelley says, that is like the world singing and wants what the Lord's people have, the inner beauty and character. Absolutely. I think, and as we talk about Esther in chapter 2, it said that she didn't have to take anything with her. You know, they all got to choose something they wanted to take before the king, and she didn't take anything. And I think it says that she found favor with the eunuch who was over the harem or whatever. She found favor with so many people in the king's house, and I do think they saw something in her that they didn't see in anyone else, and I think it was something that God had given her. And I think that we can take that for our lives today, that and you know, we always ask the question, what do we learn about God and what do we learn about ourselves? And something that I learned here about Esther is that the world saw something in her that they didn't see in anybody else. And I want the world to see something in me that they don't see necessarily in I want them to see something in God's people that they don't see in the world, like they saw in Esther, for sure. So our next question was, what do we know so far about Esther and Mordecai? We get a ton of information in the first 2 chapters about these 3 characters, the king, Ahasuerus, Esther, and Mordecai. We get a ton of information. And hey, Mama, we're on Zoom. I know you had said you wanted to get back on Zoom, so the link is on the page. If you want to join. And so our question is, what do we know so far about Esther and Mordecai, and how are they set apart from the other characters in this story? Let's talk about Mordecai first. We're studying Esther, and we're talking about everybody but Esther first. So what do we know about Mordecai? You know, we read this book, and I love Esther, and she's a hero in my book, but I think Mordecai is a real hero in this story. We wouldn't have Esther without Mordecai. And so I don't want to take anything away from him. Mordecai, a cool fact about Mordecai is that he was, verse 5 tells us, he was a Jew. He was the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. And guess who else was a son of Kish, a son of Benjamite? Does anybody know? There's actually a couple people. Shelly, the Zoom link, I posted it on the page this morning. Probably if you just go to the next post under the live video, it should be there. King Saul. King Saul was from the line of Kish, and he was a Benjamite. And then also the prophet Jeremiah. I think I read that somewhere. But Saul was the one that stood out to me. I was like, I know I remember this name. I know I remember Kish. And someone being from the line of Benjamin. And it was King Saul. So Mordecai had a little royal blood there. So let's see. Things that we're talking about. Mordecai, let's see. Marianne says he raised Esther. He was compassionate, caring, wise, courageous, from the tribe of Benjamin, and a descendant of Saul. Yeah. he took on Esther, and he didn't have to. It said that Esther was his uncle's daughter, so Esther would have been his cousin, and her mom and dad both passed away. And so Mordecai took her to raise. And I don't know, I guess it being Father's Day weekend too, I just think, wow, I have so much respect for Mordecai that he was a man who was willing to step up and take on a young girl to raise. It's scary enough having kids, but I would think, being a man and taking on a young girl to raise, like having to fix her hair and all the girly things, it would have applied to Mordecai too. So Mordecai took Esther to raise, and Mordecai had been through a lot. If we read about Mordecai in verse 6, it says, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. So he had lived through the exile, which makes me think too that he was a little older. If we just look at the timeline, it says that he had been among the captives carried away. So that was 70 years. The exile was 70 years. So he was at least in his 70s. And I think probably older. So Mordecai had been through a lot. He had deep-seated ties to the Jewish history. He had been through all of that. Let's see, some sources say he was her uncle and some say her cousin. Yeah, to me, I just think, because I always thought he was her uncle. I just always assumed he was her uncle. And maybe it was maybe just because of the age, maybe just because of the way that, he treats her. But when I read, it said that he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle. And so the daughter of his uncle would be his cousin, right? So, who knows? They were family. They were family, and he had taken her on to raise. And he's possibly the author of the book of Esther. So, we know a lot about Mordecai. And what Mordecai does here in this chapter is he says, hey, I heard the king's looking for a new wife. Esther, come on, we're going to get you in there. And then he's just kind of giving her instructions. He says, hey, don't tell them who you are. Don't tell them you're a Jew. You're just going to go in there. You're going to do what they say. And then I just love this, verse 11. It says, and every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. And we don't know about all the other women who were, vying for their chance to be the queen. We don't know if their families came and walked through the courts every day to check on them. But we get this picture of Mordecai, and it's just really heartwarming. It doesn't talk about Mordecai having a wife or any other children. And so to me, I just imagine that it's just Mordecai and Esther kind of against the world. And he's looking, he's found this great opportunity for her. And she's his girl. She's his little girl. And he goes and he checks on her every day. And I think he's just a great example of a father figure in this story. And really, though, in Mordecai, he's looking out for Esther, but he's looking out for the people of God, too. So he was a father not just to Esther, but he was a man of God and a spiritual father, too. So let's see if there's anything else we know about Mordecai that I didn't write down. The end of chapter 2, we read a little bit about Mordecai in verses 19 through 23, but I don't want to talk about that yet. Let's just put a pin in that, and we'll come back and talk about that in a few minutes. So finally, let's talk about Esther. What do we know about Esther? Esther doesn't do a lot of talking here. we just we read about her. We read that she was very beautiful. She found favor with the king, with everyone that she came in contact with. And the greatest word I would use to describe Esther in this chapter is that she was obedient. And I think her obedience took her a really long way. She did everything Mordecai, he was the father figure in her life. He was the authority in her life. And she did everything that he asked her to do, and it worked out. It worked out. And so to me, Esther I thought about three things when I thought about Esther. And so, we always ask the question, what do I learn about God and what do I learn about myself? And Esther, I feel like I really learned a big lesson here from Esther today. This week as I studied her. The three traits I wrote down: that Esther was beautiful, Esther was obedient, and Esther found favor. Her beauty was something that God gave her. She couldn't do that for herself. Her beauty was something that God gave her. She found favor with everyone. She found favor with the king and with the leader and all of that. And so I think God gives us favor, but in a way that's kind of what the people around her gave to her as well. And then finally, she was obedient. That was what she did. That's what she gave herself, if you will. And so I guess what I learned here is that God doesn't need anything from us but our obedience. That we can rely on everything God has already given us, and we can take everything, every opportunity that this world has to offer. But besides what God has already given us, all we need is obedience. I don't know if that's making sense to y'all. Maybe it spoke more to me than I'm able to get it out. But that sometimes I think we get focused on, we need to be this and we need to be that and we need to do this and we need to do that. And really all we need is to be obedient and trust that God is going to make up the rest. Our youth pastor, when I was in the youth group, when I was growing up, he told us that his dad would always say, you do everything you can and then trust God to do what you can't. And I think that comes into play here, that we have to work with what God's given us and we have to work with the opportunities that we're given, and then we have to trust God to do the rest. And Esther here, it says that they told him, you can take all of this stuff. You can take one thing with you, and they gave her all of this stuff, but it says that she took nothing besides what they told her to take. She took nothing, except that she did take something with her. She took God. She took what God had given her, and she had God with her. And so I think, it's just a good lesson for me there that, I don't have to have anything besides what God has placed in me. Let's see, Shelley says we should use God's gift in obedience and we will receive favor from others. Absolutely. That's a good just summary of all the words that I just blabbed out. So thank you, Shelley. And too, that we can find favor in the world and it can work to our benefit. What is it? Oh, I saw very interesting. This is just world news. I don't watch the news. I really don't. I never watch. If something's going on and I feel like I need some information, I'll do some research and I'll read some articles. But I won't watch the news because it stresses me out so bad. Every now and then I'm like, I would really like to watch the morning show and, like learn a new recipe or hear some celebrity gossip or something. But I just don't even do that anymore because I don't enjoy it like I used to. But the other day, for some reason, the news was on in our house. Because my husband doesn't watch the news either, but for some reason the news was on. And I happened to hear this as I was like passing through the room, I happened to hear this clip, and it was talking about in Mexico, I think, that the cartel has taken a break from all their dealing and willing to give back to their communities. And it showed members of the cartel delivering groceries and all kinds of stuff to people who are sick and stuck in their homes, who are in quarantine. And I was like, what? That is so crazy. Of course, I was trying to tell Joseph, and Joseph was like, Anna, don't you know that's how cartels work? They take care of their people. You know, if you cross them, you're in trouble, but they take care of their people too. And I was like, well, I didn't know that. I don't know a lot about cartels. But it just kind of made me think about, as I was reading this, I wrote down that we can find favor in the world and it can work to our benefit. And it reminded me of the cartel delivering those groceries to the people who were in trouble, that, you know, God can use anybody. God can use anybody. And when we have a need, or when, you know, I think about when maybe you're looking for a job opportunity, or maybe, you know, you're just, whatever it is that you need in your life, that God can use anybody to help out his children. And so I think that's the interesting thing about the story of Esther, is that King Ahasuerus was not a Jew. He was not a child of God. All of these people, they were Persians. They were in the world. But God used them to bless the children of Israel. And I think that it works for us today. We can find favor. You know, my husband is a pastor, but he also works for Comcast, which is one of the most sinful companies in the world. If you have Comcast internet, TV, whatever, that's fine. So do we. Joseph works for it. But, you know, just every now and then they'll come out with something, or obviously, you know, the things that are on TV, and just, you know, but Joseph working for them, we hear about the things that they support and the things that happen in the company. And it's so sinful. I mean, it's a worldly company. It's not like a Christian-owned business or anything. It's a worldly company, and just some of the things that they promote, you know, don't line up with our values. But Joseph has found so much favor in that company, and God has used them to bless our life tremendously. Some people know, and there's not very many people watching right now, but Joseph tested positive for the coronavirus last week. And he hasn't been too sick. He's been really tired, is pretty much the worst symptom. He's been super tired, sleeping a lot, and just besides that, a sore throat. He said he would have thought he had strep throat, was really how it was. And so we're back in quarantine. But he called his job, and they have given them 30 hours of Corona time. They called it something else, but we've been calling it Corona time. They've given them 30 hours and said that, you know, if you get sick, or if you have a family member who is sick and you need to take them groceries, or you need to take someone to the doctor, you can use this Corona time, and it won't use your sick leave or your vacation time. And so that was really cool. And so when Joseph found out he had tested positive, he called his boss and he said, you know, I'm just going to he only works 3 days a week anyways, Mondays, Fridays, and Saturdays. And so he said, I'm just going to take Monday off because I really don't feel bad. I'm just going to take Monday off, and then I'll be ready to be back Friday and Saturday. And they called him Tuesday morning and said, you know, we don't want you to, we want you to get better, and we don't want you to have to use your Corona time either. So we're just going to give you 2 weeks of paid leave, admin paid leave. He didn't have to use his vacation time. He didn't have to use his sick time, and he didn't have to use his Corona time, which is what this was for. They said, you know, you might need it later in the year if someone in your family gets sick, and we want you to keep all 30 of those hours. And he said, well, I will probably feel like coming back before 2 weeks. And they said, don't worry about it. Just take your 2 weeks. And so that should, I couldn't believe it. But then I could too, because God does stuff like this for us all the time. And I tell Joseph all the time, I'm like, Joseph, that's favor. That's God's favor working in your, working for your good. And God used a company that isn't about serving him, but used them to bless our lives. And, it's paid leave too. I don't know if I said that. So it's really nice. And so I just think, going back to our focus always, and the name of our Bible study, the Kingdom Minded Women's Bible Study. I think when you are kingdom minded, that you will find favor wherever you go, and that God will use anybody to bless your life. And I think that's evidenced in the book of Esther, that Esther and Mordecai, they were kingdom minded. Mordecai, he knew, and we find out later, he knew that Esther becoming queen was about, he'd lived through the exile. He knew it was more than just protecting Esther. It was about protecting the kingdom of God. And so when you live your life about the kingdom and about serving God's people, then God takes care of you. God will take care of you, and you will find favor. And I think that's something that maybe we could add to our prayer, or that I need to add. Whenever Joseph was going into the office to work a couple years ago before he started working from home, I remember I would pray every day on my way to work, God, give him favor. And I know that he prayed that for me too. God, give Anna favor on her job. And we've seen it so many times, just so many open doors, and so many times we've just been shooed in, and we're like, we have no right to be here. Joseph doesn't have a college degree or anything, and he has a job where everyone else that works with him has like a master's degree, and so it's just been so much favor time after time. And so I just want to encourage, sorry, I'm like preaching this morning, but I just want to encourage you to maybe add that to your prayer list. When you pray for yourself and when you pray for your family members, God, show them favor wherever they go. And I just would love to hear how that works in your benefit, and how God opens up doors for you. The last thing I want to talk about is just verses 19 through 23. My Bible says Mordecai discovers a plot, is the little heading. And so I think this is just a little snippet. It's just a little something that happens, and you think like, that's really interesting. Why is that here? But it comes back into play later. So I don't want you to forget about this little passage. So what happens is Esther has still, this was something else I learned about Esther. Sorry, rewind and then we'll fast forward. Is that Esther kept quiet. It keeps saying, Esther still hadn't told anybody who she was. She hadn't made it known. That was the one thing Mordecai told her, don't tell anybody. And so Esther kept quiet. She didn't, Anna, open her big mouth and tell everything she knows. That was my mom's advice. I saw this thing going around today, says, what is in honor of Father's Day, what's something your dad always said? Because we know dads have those little dadisms. My dad's was, it's all fun and games until someone loses an eye. Said that every day of our lives, because I don't know why, because we were all girls, and it's not like we were going around being super violent or anything, but that's what he always said. It's all fun and games till someone loses an eye. And then his other thing was always, you took it too far. Which we got from him. So, but my mom's was, every time we left the house, don't tell everything you know. And it's really good advice. The Bible says in Proverbs that a woman without discretion is like a gold ring in a pig's snout. And I mean, who can say it better than the Bible? The Bible just tell you like it is. But my mom always said, don't tell everything you know. And I feel like that was what Mordecai was saying to Esther. Hey, don't tell everything you know. And she didn't. And it worked out for her. And so maybe that's a lesson that I learned from Esther too. Just keep quiet. That was actually the Lord spoke to me in January. I try to pick like a word for the year. What's going to be my word, to kind of just define how I live this year. And one year it was discipline, and that was a major fail because I was tested in every way possible. But this year, my word was listen. And so when I was reading that about Esther, it brought it back to how the Lord had just impressed on my heart this year to listen. And my goodness, how that has come into play this year, where I have found so many times it's best just to listen to what others are saying. I don't always have to talk. And so that's something I learned about Esther. But anyways, verse 19, Mordecai's at the king's gate. Esther still hasn't told anybody who she is. But as Mordecai comes to the king's gate every day, he starts to hear about this plan that these two people are really upset with the king, and they've got a plan to kill him. And so Mordecai tells Esther. Esther tells the king what Mordecai heard, and then finds out that it's true. The men were planning or plotting against the king, and they're both hanged, and it's recorded in the book of Chronicles in the presence of the king. And so I don't really want to say, there's not actually much to say here. It is what it is. It's just part of the story. But I do want to say to remember that, because it comes back. It plays a pretty important part in the book later on. So I want to know this morning, I've got a few friends still hanging on with me. What did you learn from the first 2 chapters of Esther? What stands out to you? What did you learn about God? What did you learn about yourself from this first part of the Bible study? And next week we'll do chapter 3, chapter 4. I think we could do 3, 4, and 5. How many chapters are there? Oh, yeah. We'll do 3, 4, and 5. Next week. So awesome. Guys, let me know what you're learning. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you next week.